Welcome you to How to Make Interactive Dashboards in Excel. Thanks for attending this free sample webinar, part of StraightLine's new Power Analytics series. We hope you enjoy it, and most importantly, that you take some useful ideas back with you to work. First, some housekeeping. If you are using VoIP and you're having trouble hearing, please make sure the volume is turned up on your computer. After the webinar, you'll be prompted automatically to complete a short survey. Now, we're looking for your feedback on this. If you have a question at any time during the webinar, please use the question function in the GoToWebinar panel as shown over here on the right. At the end of the webinar, we'll try to answer everyone's questions. Today is part of a three-part series, and today's goal is to give you a flavor of dashboard design and what you can do in new Excel. And by that, I mean Excel 2010 or afterward. A few things can only be done in Excel 2013 or Excel 365, and I'll try my best to remember to point out all of those as we come to them. Part 2 will be much more in-depth and drill into dashboard design, the Excel data model, interactivity without breaking a sweat, and Excel's Power Pivot. Now, Power Pivot is native in Excel 2013 and 365, but it is available as a free add-in for Excel 2010. Part 3, we're going to get even more advanced. We'll cover how to incorporate millions of data points, something early Excel versions could only dream of, and how to incorporate mapping tools for cool geographical visualizations. We'll also show you how to incorporate disparate data sources, from databases and text files, for example, and to create on-the-fly calculations that use data from those sources. We'll cover advanced charts and tiny infographics called spark lines, and we'll discuss how you can share your dashboards effectively across groups within your company. Today we're going to quickly define what dashboards are, review some basic visual design concepts, and spend most of the hour building a dashboard in Excel. Let's have a look at a few dashboards. You might find these on a Google search today. Now, mind you, I'm not endorsing these as great or as poor. We're just going to have a look. Now, this first dashboard is kind of old school, has a lot of plots, all alike, which is good for making comparisons, but we'll note it's also very cramped. Here's a more modern dashboard. It's a sales dashboard. It has a modern, clear, clean design that's visually appealing. In the upper left, we have filtering. We also see comparisons of groups and to an overall regional average. A modern pie chart in the bottom shows a sales breakdown where various sales are coming from. And we see some rather large numbers with some green directional indicators right next to them. This, on this airline's dashboard, there's a lot of attention given to visual appeal with fancy design elements. Some 3D, some angled pie charts and shading. Now, some of this works, but some of it is clearly difficult to see. At the top of this dashboard, it says mouse over and click for interactive elements. This is a common way to incorporate interactivity into your dashboard. This executive dashboard has lots of different variables and plots. The time series for margin and expenses and for revenue, those time series plots on the left, they can help you spot trends and relationships between these three variables or KPIs, key performance indicators. We also see a world map here which shows density of sales. This hotel dashboard shows revenue per room. The time plot at the time is an increasingly common, at the top, is an increasingly common element that's in a lot of dashboards, in that it has a window that's below it that allows you to slice various parts of it and zoom in. Again, we have a geographic display, but we also have some unique over-under displays and some color coding for good and bad performance. So what can we gather from all these examples? Stephen Few, a guru in graphical display of data and of dashboards, defines dashboards as a visual display of the most important information needed to achieve one or more objectives, which fits entirely on a single computer screen so it can be monitored at a glance. Boiling this down a bit, however, we can say that first, dashboards are visual displays. Information dashboards come about from analogies with cockpits and cars, and while that analogy breaks down a bit, one thing that remains is the visual nature of dashboards. Second, dashboards contain only the most important information geared to meeting specific business needs. Dashboard information isn't only relevant to executives or accountants or even only to managers. It's information that's used by people who have business problems to solve, and that's just about everybody. Finally, dashboards are used to monitor information, generally quantitative information, at a glance. They fit on one screen. Now, before we get to building our own dashboard, let's take a look at a few scary dashboards and things that we can avoid, or that we'll want to avoid. The information in this dashboard might be useful, or it might be helpful. It's really hard to tell because we've got this photo that's inserted into the background, which clutters up the display. While dashboards do need to be appealing, in order for them to solve problems, their information needs to be seen. Let the data be the star of your dashboard, and just here, it just isn't. Here we have a literal dashboard. It takes a dashboard and cockpit analogy way too far. It's difficult to quickly understand the context and the meaning of the data that's displayed here. Measures of simply a statement of facts rarely works alone. It needs good context or good supporting data. But here it just doesn't exist. The red, yellow, and green helps a little, but if you look at the safety gauge, for example, it says 111. I'm not sure if that's good or bad. We just don't know. This is probably my favorite bad dashboard. It violates so many rules, it's really hard to know where to start. Chief among them are, number one, it uses unnecessary visual effects like 3D and super heavy shading. All of this really obscures the data. And number two, it uses very high saturation, high contrast, I'd say garish colors. These colors tell our brains to assign meaning to all the contrasts. If everything's important, nothing is important. The result is brain overload. This dashboard's a little like the boy who cried wolf. As you can see, just having a visual dashboard isn't enough. Good dashboards do need to be visually appealing, but they also need to have other characteristics. They need to be intuitive and clear. Being small and concise is important because we need to put a lot of information onto a single screen. They need to have a powerful design. As Frank Lloyd Wright said, form follows function. So, for example, interactivity, while it can be great for a business analyst, an executive might prefer a clear display of many variables. Different problems and different objectives require different solutions. Now, we won't really talk about much of this today, but data sources need to be reliable and of high quality. In fact, much of the work in building a good dashboard comes from diligent discussion of which variables matter, their clear operational definitions, policies and procedures for collecting them, etc. Finally, any summaries or comparisons or alerts in the display must be designed with statistical soundness. So how do you avoid all these nightmares? Well, it's not easy, but a few rules of thumb will really get you get you very far. And the three that are my favorite are, number one, eliminate chart junk. Number two, avoid fancy effects into yours. And the golden rule, above all, show the data. As I said before, the data really needs to be the star of your show. Let's go over a couple of examples. This display of a histogram from Minitab, we want to note, there's lots of little data boxes on here. Now, this might be interesting to a statistician. I mean, we're kind of a strange lot, I know. But on a dashboard, it's completely out of place. Notice how small the actual plot is compared to the size of the panel. It's minuscule. This is critical because real estate on a dashboard is absolutely precious. Here's a solution to that, and it's actually pretty simple. Just remove the boxes. And just in doing that, you can see, for example, this plot is much bigger compared to the size of the panel. While this isn't perfect, it's a vast, vast improvement. Here's another example. Among many things with this graph has many unnecessary fancy effects like 3D, which obscures the data and makes it really hard to understand. And you know, the colors aren't really helping either. And the only reason we have them is because it's a poor choice of chart. Here we've chosen a pie chart, and the net result of this is your brain has to go from left to right to left to right. Your eyes have to constantly travel to remember what those colors mean. Here's a way of fixing that that's much easier to understand. In this plot, the ordering is much clearer, and the colors aren't really even relevant, and grayscale is just fine. And we can tell at a glance finance and energy are the most active sectors, while medical and communication are the least. Okay, now we've come to the fun part. Let's actually build a real dashboard in Excel. We're going to build an interactive analytics dashboard. Now, this is what we're aiming for. This is kind of the finished product, and we're going to use data from the Olympics because it's data that's fairly easy to understand. But you can think of this type of dashboard as being for a group of analysts, or maybe an operations supervisor or manager, or maybe for a small group of people. So we're going to go ahead and build that data now. I'm switching to our Excel. So here's our data. And this data is courtesy of The Guardian. And it doesn't include 2012, so it goes up to 2008. Let's just go quickly through all of these data elements. We've got a medalist ID. That's not all that interesting. We've got a date of the event that the event occurred. We've got the athlete. We've got the country of that athlete. We've got the gender. We've got that athlete's gender. We've got the event that athlete took place, participated in, and we've got the medal that they won, the season that it was in, and the sport that it was in. So, for example, swimming is a type, the 1500 meter freestyle is a type of swimming, so it's kind of a categorization of the events. Now, I should say that this is only for medal winners. So before we begin, it's always good to think about the questions that you might want to ask about the data. And just a few basic questions that I might want to ask are, I might care about medal counts, maybe I care about them over time. Or maybe I care about by country. I might care about which countries are obtaining the most medals. Or maybe I care about sports. Maybe I care about which medals occur in which sports. Okay, and I'd also like to think about how I might want to slice and dice the data to get insight into it. And so I might want to slice and dice the data by gender, or by medal, type of medal, or maybe by season, winter or summer. All of those might be interesting to me. Okay, now that we're getting ready to begin, I'm going to make this into a table, and you'll see I'm selecting this and choosing Control-T, and that creates a table for my data right here, and that just makes it easier for me to do a couple of different things. In particular, make a pivot table. And our dashboard today that we're going to design is going to rely heavily on two different tricks. One is a fairly well-known but huge trick, and that is pivot tables. So pivot tables, if you use them, you know they're great for slicing and dicing data, but they're not very visual, and dashboards are, of course, visual. So pivot tables are one of the tricks. The second trick that we're going to use extensively to interact with our data and to probe our data and get insight into it is something called a slicer. So those are the two tricks that we're going to use, and Control-T making this a table just makes it a little bit easier. So let's go ahead and put in a pivot table. Now, there are many roads that lead to Rome on this one, but one of the easiest is just to click on the Insert tab, and I'm going to click a pivot table. So we're going to add our first pivot table, and it says my range is table 1. That's easy enough, and I'm going to put it into a new worksheet. So let me go ahead and do that. So here's our first pivot table palette, if you will. I'm going to move this into let's see, just a second here. Sorry about that. I'm going to move the date of the event into rows. Whoops. And I'm going to grab medal, and I'm going to pull it over into the math area right here. And the default that comes up is the count. So what I'm going to do is I'm counting the medals by year. So you can see in 1900 there were 512 metals and so forth. Now before we go any further, let's just note this. Note that in 1924 there's a number of different entries, and I only really want one entry. And there's a cool little trick in Excel that you can use right now to roll that up. If you just select in any one of these, and we're going to go to Analyze, whoops, and we're going to go to Analyze. I'm going to click Group Field, and Excel allows you to group your data, in this case dates, and to segment it. So it was segmented into months. We're going to select years. Now if you have operational data, maybe you have it down to the day, and you can segment it down to the day, and it'll provide easy segments for all of those. It's really quite an amazing time saver when it works. So watch what happens when I click this. You'll see that all of the dates for 1924 were in fact rolled up into one date, which is going to be very helpful for us. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and practice. One of the things that I preach often is to initially do a plot of the data. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And we're going to use a special type of plot called a pivot chart, which is actually very helpful because it will update whenever our pivot table updates. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Pivot Chart. I'm going to select Line Plot, and I'll put dots on that. And there we go. There's our beautiful line plot. It may not be the most beautiful, but already just taking a moment to look at it, which is always good to immediately look at your plots once you make them, you can see right away there's a few things that we'll want to spot. There's a point right here that's a big spike around 1920. Let me make this a little bit bigger so we can see it. Around 1920 there's a spike. Then there's a drop and a bit of an increase. And then there's a sawtooth pattern that's going on at the end of the plot. We'll just file those things away because we'll be interested in knowing about them a little bit later. Right now, what we want to do is I'm going to put a couple more pivot charts into here so we can really get our dashboard going. Okay? Before I do, I'm going to label this. Excel labels these pivot charts in rather boring ways, and I'm going to change that a little bit. I'm going to type in here the year. I'm just going to type year _ metal. And I'm going to also rename the pivot table. You see it named it Pivot Table 1, which is not all that interesting. I'm going to name it year pivot, or year pivot is fine. There we go. Okay, now let's make a couple of other ones. I'm going to make a pivot table of the country and a pivot table of the metal count by sport. So let's do the one of country first. I'm going to paste this onto the existing worksheet, same place, and just give myself a little bit of room here by putting it in column S. There we go. And I'm going to pull down country into rows, and just as I did before, metal into the math area, and there we go. I'm going to label this as well. I'm going to call it country. And I'm going to name the pivot table up here where it says pivot table name. I'm going to name it country. Oh, capital C. There we go. Okay. Great. Now let's add one more. Let's add the sport. So I go to Insert again, Pivot Table. Again, I'm going to put it on the existing worksheet. I'm going to put it a little bit farther to the right. I'm doing this so I can, so I have some room to put my plots and some room to work. There it is right there. And this time I'm going to pull down sport into rows and metal into the values. I'll relabel this sport. And I'll label my pivot table. I'll call it sport. Okay. Great. And you know, while I'm at it, I think what I'm going to do is also move this year. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to move the pivot table by clicking on entering anywhere in the pivot table. I'll click on Move It, and I'm going to move it. I'll move it to the right of Sport. Okay, so I've got plenty of room over there. All right. Now, let's add a couple of plots here. So let's add a couple of other plots. So let's go to Country, and I think maybe what I want to do is add a If I go to Pivot Table Tools, I will add a pivot chart. I'm going to add a bar chart of country. And I'll just kind of move that over. And I'll do the same thing with sport. I'll add a, let's just do the same thing. I'll add a bar chart. Okay. I've got two bar charts going and a line chart. Okay, now it's kind of hard to read some of these, so let's work on that a little bit. Remember when we had the nightmare gallery and we showed you there were some rules of thumb? I'm going to practice what I preach here, and we'll remove some of that chart junk and all that kind of thing. One of the first things that you can do yourself a favor is to change the background in Excel, because by default Excel's background for the plots are white. I'm going to change the background of all of my cells to a little bit gray. And now I can see when I move those plots around, it's much easier to see. Remember, the goal here is to get to a place where we're going to be able to do some analytics. So, so that's what we're going to be able to do. Now, let's see if we can fix up these plots a little bit. And I told you, by default, a lot of plots, they have a lot of unnecessary things on them. And that makes a difference when we try to make things small. Check out this. When I make this plot small, there's all sorts of, it's really difficult to read. And I may not need to make this plot this small, but I'll probably want to make some plots pretty small. So let's see if we can improve on that a bit. One of the things to do is just eliminate some of the chart junk. So I'm going to get rid of the legend here just by hitting the delete key. And I'll get rid of these buttons. Now these buttons can be helpful for some selection, but we're going to use a different tool today. We're going to use slicers to do that. So I'm going to remove these buttons as well. So I'm going to get rid of, I'm right-clicking on this, and I'm going to click Select Hide All Field Buttons on Chart. There we go. I'm also going to change the title of this chart, and I'm just going to make it equal the title of my pivot table, which was year. So, or year metal. There we go. And we can make this bold or whatever we want to do. We could make this smaller even if we wanted to, but I think that's good enough and kind of drives home the point. Now look at when I make it about equally small, this is still a readable chart. So it really makes a big difference. Okie doke. So let's now look at maybe a bit of a bigger challenge, and that is these bar charts here. Now, removing the chart junk is a good idea, and let's do that quickly. Here I am removing the legend and removing the field buttons by the right click, and I'll change the title just because I can. Okay, so there we go, and I'll bold the title. But I still have a problem here, and the problem is, of course, that there's so many countries here, I can't really even read it. Now I have two choices. I could make the chart extremely big, which kind of defeats the purpose of a dashboard, or I could use another feature in Excel. Now that feature is if I click on this axis, and I'm going to right-click, I can filter this in a number of different ways. One of Excel's best filters is top 10. And this works great for bar charts. Check this out. I'm going to click this top 10 filter and look at that. Now I've filtered it so I only have the top 10. All of a sudden this is a very readable chart and very useful as well. I'm going to further make it better by sorting it. So if I select it, I can sort, and I don't have to sort. I could sort alphabetically, but I can also sort based on the count. So that's what I'm going to do. And look at that. Now I've got a chart that is sorted from greatest to least, and I can tell pretty quickly at a glance that the United States is pretty much heavily in the lead in terms of the metal count here overall. Now watch what happens when I shrink this down. I can still even read that even if it's a fairly small plot. So pretty big improvement on that. Okay, I'm going to quickly now do the same thing for my country, or for my sport chart here, removing the legend, removing the field buttons, filtering top 10, and sorting. There we go, and I'm going to change the title. Here we go. There it is, sport. Okay. And I even wanted to make it bold. Here we go. So we've actually got it shaping up pretty well. Now I'm actually even going to add a little bit more pizzazz by changing the color of this so we can see that that's a little bit different, so we can distinguish those a little bit more quickly. And I'll click on the bars right here, and I'm going to just go ahead and click the orange. It might not be perfect, but now I can tell the sports from the country. And I've got some things going here. I've got three charts in a fairly compact space. Okay, now that I've got all this set up, I want to start to do some analysis. And this is really where the fun part begins. I'm going to move these over just a little bit so I have a little bit more room in my palette, or on my palette. And as advertised, we're going to slice and dice these, and of course we're going to use slicers to do it. Now again, there's a number of ways to do this in Excel. You're spoiled for choice, which is one of the problems in Excel. There's so many different ways. Let me show you that probably the easiest way to assign a slicer to a plot, and that is to click on that plot. You'll see pivot chart tools come up. We're going to click on Analyze, and I'm going to insert a slicer. Click on that. Now I want to point out slicers are available in Excel 2010 and afterward. So all of this is available to 2010. All right, but if you're using before that, then you're out of luck. Okay, let's just click a few things that we can slice on. How about country, gender? How about metal, season, and sport? So 5 different slicers. I'm going to click OK. And there you go. Excel gives you what you asked for, 5 different things. And you can see that you can just pick them up and arrange them. You can resize them, which is what I'm doing right here, to give yourself a little more room. There we go. And I'll do that with season. There we go. Just rearranging a little bit. And check this out. If I look over here where it says year metal, which is the chart that I connected it to, if I click on, for example, something in country, let's click on USA. Watch what's going to happen. When I click on this, and carefully observe over on the left, when I click on this, that chart changes. So I can select different categories. If I wanted to add not just USA, but also Uzbekistan, I could do that by holding down the Control key. Now I've added that in. If I wanted to include Great Britain, I could do that by clicking on GBR, and so forth. And every selection that I've got is reflected in the chart to the left. So I can very quickly look for patterns. If I wanted, I can use multiple slicers for it as well. So if I only wanted to see how the men were doing over those years, I could click on men as well. And now I'm looking at Great Britain as well as United States, as well as Uzbekistan, and only the men for that. So it's pretty neat. You can look very quickly for patterns. So let's challenge ourselves a little bit and see if we can identify some of the patterns that we pointed out in the very beginning. How about the sawtooth pattern right there? Could it have to do with the type of metal? Well, let's check it out very quickly. Let's see if we click on bronze, if we get a different picture than if we click on gold and silver. Kind of looks the same to me. How about gold? How about silver? They all look kind of the same. How about silver and gold? They all kind of look the same to me, so I don't think there's much of a difference there. Let's now try, how about summer and winter? He says knowingly. Look at what happens when we click on summer. When we click on summer, that sawtooth pattern goes away. Same thing what happens when we click on winter, but when we have both activated, that sawtooth pattern begins. If you recall, up until 1992, the Olympics, both the Winter and the Summer Olympics, occurred in the same year. However, after 92, they started separating them out every 2 years instead of every 4 years. So every 2 years, an Olympics is held, and it's either the Olympics for the winter or the summer. It's not both. So that accounts for that sawtooth pattern. There are differing amounts of medals given out in the Summer and Winter Olympics. So you probably knew that, but even if you didn't, it's amazing how quickly you could discern that using these slicers. So pretty cool. Let's leave it on summer now for just a moment and see if we can also solve another mystery, and that is what's been causing this increase in the number of medals that are given out. Now, you might have a theory that, and I think that if you're thinking of these things, it all makes sense. You might think that maybe more countries have been added since, or have been included in the Olympics since they started in Greece in 1896, or maybe different sports have been added. But I'm going to save us the trouble, and I've already done some looking into this. So let's try looking at gender and see if that can help us. Well, when we click on men, we do see that there was this spike in 1920. It went down and then has steadily climbed. That's pretty interesting, but watch what happens when we click on women. The medals given out for women's events, we see this precipitous rise, particularly beginning in 1972, where the number of medals has almost increased fivefold since 1972. So it's really gender. It's really the number of women's events which has explained the huge rise in medals given out. Pretty interesting and very easy to see clicking around very quickly by using these slicers. Very helpful. Now, this might inform what we want to put in our end dashboard. We might want to separate that out and provide that comparison. If that's a comparison that we found interesting or insightful, we might want to actually separate that out and move it into yet another plot. So notice how the analysis that you're doing is really sort of informing the insight that you'll get and the end dashboard that you'll end up with. Okay, well, that was a cool trick, but one of the things that would be really nice is the following. What if we clicked on, wouldn't it be really nice if we clicked on, let's go back to examining the USA for just a moment. And wouldn't it be really nice if we clicked on the USA and not only this line plot updated, but we also had our country plot update and our sport plot update, or in general, all the plots update. Well, you can do that too. And it's amazing with slicers that you can do that through something called report connections. So check it out. When I select this slicer, or any slicer for that matter, and I right-click on it, select report connections, and what it's going to do is it's going to tell me which pivot tables it's connected to. It says it's connected to the year pivot. I'm going to connect it to sport and to country. And now look what happens. When I select USA, only USA is selected in all of these plots. It updates all of them at once. Now you can use this to anything you want. You can use it to pivot table lists. It's just a fantastic tool to be able to do that. You want to include Uzbekistan as well. There we go. There it is right there. And again, including Great Britain, just like we did before. Look at that. All the plots update. You can see the patterns in all the plots simultaneously. Pretty cool. And again, it also applies to, I'm going to connect all of these report connections. So all of these slicers, for every one that you want to work, you have to connect them up to all the reports. So you should use the slicers a bit sparingly as you're putting these together. Now I've got them all connected up, and so when I select men here, now I'm only looking at the men from Great Britain and the USA and Uzbekistan, and only the summer. If I want to look at summer and winter, there we go. So, pretty amazing and quick in terms of what you can do. All right. Now, I do want to show you one other thing that we saw that was a characteristic of modern dashboards, and that was to put in that funky timeline at the very bottom. And that is really a special type of slicer. What if I wanted to examine more deeply the timeline or the USA's, it seems like it's very dominant in the Summer Olympics. I wonder if that's dominant. Let me take off some of these, and I'll just select USA. Actually, whoops, I lost my top 10 here. Go back to that. There we go. I've got my top 10. So it looks like it's dominant over this time period. I wonder if it's dominant over all time periods, and so, or over a specific time period, let's say at the beginning. I wonder if we can look at that. So we can add a certain type of slicer. Again, I'm going to select it for the time. Whoops. For my time series plot. This time, instead of a slicer, I'm going to add a timeline. Now, this is something that is only available in 2013. If you don't have 2013, You just have to use a regular old slicer, which works fine, but it's not as not quite as slick as the one we're going to build right here. And there we go. I'm going to put this on years. And let's say I wanted to understand what was going on in the beginning of the century. Look at that. I can select just those years. Well, let me select all the way, say, up to 1932. And I've got it. So it does turn out that the U.S. was fairly dominant even early on in terms, or one of the leaders, in terms of that medal count, which is pretty interesting. We could examine very quickly Great Britain. Let's see if that held for Great Britain. Oops, I lost it there. There it is, right there, GBR. Yeah, in fact, it looked like they really peaked and then went down. Let's see if what that whole picture looks like. Yeah. So again, these things really allow you to examine pretty deeply all sorts of things. And again, if we wanted to connect this to all the reports, we simply can do it this way, and now everything updates just like we want it to. Once again, I lost my top 10. There we go, back to that. Okay, so I think I've given you a flavor for how all of this works, and I'm having a lot of fun. But let me show you the finished dashboard. And you can see that just in a little bit of time, we've actually gone pretty far into creating something that doesn't look too bad. Oops. And with a little bit of work, we can probably make it quite a bit more readable and usable. Here's the finished product. Or an example of what the finished product might look like. And I've changed the type of plot here, and now I've got a breakout of not only the medal count by date, but by bronze, silver, and gold. I've got the medal count versus date and gender, so we can see that a little bit more clearly. I've got a time slicer at the bottom. I have my medals by country, my medals by sport, and all the various drill downs. And they all work. They're all hooked up to all the plots. There we go. So you can see what happens when I click on one. They all change. And I've also got that other feature that I talked about, and that is I've got an ordered list on the right-hand side. For example, this happens to show, who are the top medal winners. So Larissa Latnina, who was an athlete in the 1956 and 60 Olympics, won the most medals, at least up to 2008. I think Michael Phelps has now surpassed her. But if we wanted to look at, who has won the most gold medals, there it is right there. There's Michael Phelps. If we cared about the 1970s, for example, we could filter that down to the 1970s. Whoops, lost a little bit there. There we go. And well, I think you get the picture, and clearly I'm having too much fun here. There we go. Let me just go through there, and you can see now Mark Spitz is the leader of the list. And the really cool thing about this, and one of the things that makes it great for the analyst, is now I can get directly to that data and notice that I can do all sorts of troubleshooting. Now I'm only looking at the data from that particular list. So if this is operations data, you can very quickly zoom in on errors or high trouble spots or things like that. Okay, so great analytics dashboard and so forth. All right. Well, now that we've seen that we can really quickly be up and running, and look at this. I mean, we built a pretty decent looking dashboard in basically 20, 30 minutes. Let's have a look at a more finished dashboard that was built recently for a coding department in a hospital. Now, this is all Excel, all of it, all these, which might look familiar to you now, as well as some of these infographics, which are truly tiny, and some of these stoplight effects and things like that, as well as the drill downs. All of this is there. And here's a more finished operations or analytics dashboard. You can see a lot of these things, the time series plot, We've got some other reference lines in here. We've got this here. We've got many drill downs, and we've got not only ordered lists, but color-coded ordered lists. So all of those things are possible in Excel. Well, that's it for today. We've covered what are dashboards. We've covered a few concepts in the display of information, and we even built a working dashboard. Not too bad for less than an hour using only Excel. So thanks so much for attending today. Remember that you will receive a short survey after the webinar is closed, and we would greatly appreciate it if you complete it and click the send button. Now we've kept it really short, so it won't take much of your time, and I really just want to thank you again for attending. I appreciate your time. And now we're going to answer any questions that you might have.
Mark, the first question is, can you show how we get to the slicer?
Absolutely. So let me to do that. Let me go back to our. Let me go back to this, and I'm going to assume that it's how do I get to the slicer in the first place. So if I click on any, I can click on any element like a plot. Let me click on this one right here, this line plot. If I click on that, I get a pivot chart tools that shows up at the top. And now if I click on Analyze, it will let me add a slicer. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to click directly on a pivot table and then pivot table tools, and it will allow me to insert a slicer. So there's a couple of different ways. It's either through the pivot chart or the pivot tool. You just have to activate it and then go to the pivot table tools. Great question.
Right. The next question is, can I watch this again?
Absolutely. We are recording this session, so you'll be able to watch it 100 times if you want. And we'll let everybody who registered will certainly let you know where it's posted. Okay, so we'll give you a link to the post as soon as it's up. Great question.
Next question is, what are your thoughts on Tableau?
Tableau. Tableau is great. I think it's fantastic, and I think it's a great product. It takes, I think it takes a little bit longer to master, but I think it's a fantastic product. A lot of the visualizations that were built into Tableau used a lot of used a lot of Edward Tufte's ideas and Stephen Few's ideas too. He was quoted in this particular webinar. Those two guys are sort of the gurus of visual display of quantitative information, and Tableau incorporates a lot of that stuff into it. I've seen some really nice dashboards using Tableau. It's great, great tool.
Next question is, how can we use this for ongoing data? My team looks at data on a weekly basis. How can I do this once and not recreate each week?
Great, great question. And first, let me just say that that's going to be covered very fully in particularly in part 3 of the webinar. But it's actually not too bad. Let me just show you the seeds of it right here. If you click on data, Excel can you can store links to different things. Let's say a SQL call or something like that to a database. Anything that's a stored procedure, and that's probably the easiest way to do it. And then you generally will have to just refresh the data. And that will come either by pressing a single button like the word refresh, or by providing something such that when somebody opens up the spreadsheet it gets refreshed. But there's also different ways to distribute it such that the end user won't even have to do any of that refresh. They'll just automatically get it, the refreshed data. So it's a great question. We've done it for a couple of different clients where we've made it so that it's either at the push of a button or something like that, so that they can, or it's connected directly to a SQL call, and we've made it such that they can get up to the minute information. So it's not your as they used to say in the 1970s commercial, it's not your father's Excel, it's not your father's Oldsmobile, it's not your father's Excel. This is really different. Great question. Do we have other
That's all.
questions?
Nope, that's all the questions we have unless anybody wants to submit another question.
Great. I see a few hands raised. Are there other questions? It looks like there's a question about showing a time slicer in 2010. I'm happy to do that. I don't know if that person is still on the line. I'm going to go ahead and show that. The only option that you've got, and it's not actually too bad, you can't have this nifty time slicer right here, but what you can do in 2010 is simply use a regular old slicer, and now I'm going to use date for the event, and there you go. So instead of selecting the years using this, slick little time slicer, which I admit I love it, it's really slick. Now I can select it this way, which isn't too bad, but it still gets the job done. So that's a great question. It's not as slick, but it gets the job done. Okay. Do we have other questions?
Nope, that's it.
Okay. Well, again, I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. I really appreciate your time.
Wait, wait,
Oh,
there are more questions.
okay, great.
Hold on. Can you show how to update the data in the dashboard? For example, when you want to update the data sets weekly, monthly, and have it update on the dashboard automatically. I think you may have covered that already.
Yeah, I've talked about how to do it. I can't really show it because I don't have any live data to show. But again, we are going to do another webinar on that. It will be covered.
The next is a partial question. While adding in last week's data into the overall data,
Uh-huh. Oh.
I,
Uh,
I think you've answered that. The answer is yes.
yes. Yeah, there's a number of different ways to do that, from the simplest or from simple ways right in Excel, like using table properties, to the more, they're not complicated, but they're just more, they reach into different places. Like if a text file gets updated by an IT dump or something like that, that's not a problem to incorporate that, as well as to do a live data feed from a database, and to tell it to only segment certain parts of the data, or to add on this week's data from last week's data. There's lots of different ways to skin that cat, so to speak. Clearly, lots of data questions are data is a critical question for usage. Absolutely.
Will there be a webinar to cover the more finished type of dashboard shown in the end?
Yes, absolutely, we will do that as well. Not just show that, but talk about much more about the design principles that we use to get there, and some of the things that we can do to make it more usable. Even though it may have been, we got a pretty decent, I think we did get to a pretty decent place in just a short amount of time. There's, in some ways, there's a few different steps that we still need to go to make this more usable so that people can use it in operations. And we will cover that, yes.
How is the timeline plot created?
The timeline plot right here, first of all of the plots that you see here are pivot charts. And so the pivot charts come from pivot tables. So you have to start by clicking on the pivot table that has the pivot table set, or the data set up the way that you want it. And then if you click on Analyze, and you can just add the pivot chart. Now this may appear in a different part of the ribbon. Like if you're in 2010, it may be, toward the center of the ribbon instead of at the side. But there will be a pivot chart. I guarantee you there will be. And when you click on that, where it says pivot chart, Excel kind of gives you a cornucopia of all the different charts that you could use, from the really simple stuff like the line chart, which is what I chose. You can see it gives you a choice of line charts too, from the 3D that I do not recommend to the really super simple ones, as well as things like pie charts. Again, not a fan of them, but it has them, and all sorts of other charts. We'll also cover, just to mention this, and there's my line chart. We'll also cover, I didn't mention this, but we'll also cover how to add different charts into this that are not on those pivot charts, because that can sometimes be a problem. What happens if you want to add a scatter plot? Scatter plot's not, oh, it is there now. Well, that's new. What happens if you want to add a chart that's not in there? We'll cover that.
How do you add the table data if you want to drill down to the specific data? You showed us that, but you didn't show us how you added it.
How I added the table data. You mean how I got the data? I'm not quite following. It might be how I got the data into this spreadsheet in the first place.
No. If you go to the PowerPoint, the finished product.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. Right here. Adding this table data. Yes. Great. I can show you right away. I'll just show you how to do that right in it. So essentially, what that really is let me get rid of this slicer right there, and I'll move this up here. Just to give myself a little more space. Essentially, what that table is just another pivot table. And I'm going to show it to you, but it's also going to show some of the design difficulties that are here. So I just add another pivot table. Let's add person. I'm going to insert pivot table, and I'm going to insert it into the existing worksheet right there. And now I've got a pivot table there, and I can add to my pivot table. Let's do athlete. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to count the medals. And there it is right there. And now I'm going to sort it. Oops. I think I have to click on one of these, and then I do the sort. There it is right there. I'll sort from count of medal. Oops, I want count of medal descending. And there it is right there. Now I've got a bunch of blanks in the Winter Olympics one, so let me take that off. Oops, I don't have it hooked up. I forgot about that. So now I'm going to hook up the report. And you see the report connections can be hooked up to pivot tables just as easily. Now when I click on this, now it updates. See, check that out. Pretty cool. That's all there is to it. And you can see that one of the difficulties is it's moving all these things around. So I have to change some properties of these slicers and some of the exhibits to make it usable. But you can see we're almost there. And there it is right there. There's the Larissa Latnina, exactly who we talked about before. Great question. Glad you asked it.
Next question is, do slicers work in PowerPoint?
Oh boy, I don't know. I've never heard of that in PowerPoint, and I don't think so, but I don't know.
Thanks for showing the time slicer, but our question was in general for any type of slicer.
For any type of slicer. Is that from somebody, Steve, can you tell me if that's from somebody that came before for the 2010?
Not sure.
Okay. Is it from somebody from Memorial Hermann? I'll just ask that because I know. All right. Anyway, I'll just answer that. So, yeah, in 2010, again, the slicers will be. You can probably. Honestly, I don't recall whether you can click on the chart and analyze and then do slicer. I don't remember whether you can do that, but I think it's from, I know for a fact that if you click on, in 2010, if you click on the, let's just pick on a pivot chart right here. I'm clicking on on my pivot table. If you click on the pivot table and anywhere in there and click Analyze, and you will find Slicer. It's going to be somewhere in your pivot table tools. You'll find Insert Slicer, and you can add that in and just by clicking that. You'll be able to add the slicers that you want. Again, the timeline is really just a special sort of slicer, so it looks different, but it really works the same way. And this, again, this would apply to any slicer. Click it, and there you go. There it is. I hope that answered the question.
Great. So I think that's it. We may have missed a question here or there. If we didn't answer your question, please call us or email us.
Here, I'll put that back up.
We'd be happy to answer any final questions.
Yeah, I'll put the number or the email address back up. You can email me personally, or you can go to our website and email us generally. Or you can call. It's all fair game. Okay, everybody. Thanks so much for attending. Really appreciate your time and your audience and all the great questions, too. Take care.